Hello and welcome to the fourth plenary session of our 2021 Conference on Justice in Jesuit Higher Education. My name is Jennifer Woolard. I'm professor and chair of the Psychology Department and adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University. I am both delighted and honored to introduce today's plenary session entitled Immigration and the Call to Justice in Jesuit Higher Education. Our plenary today will explore key aspects of immigration and the migration of peoples more broadly, considering the call of the Universal Apostolic Preferences and the role of Jesuit higher education in this area. When we consider key aspects of migration, we can consider them in what in developmental psychology we call multiple ecological levels. We understand that individuals are nested in families, which in turn are nested in local settings that may include school, employment, religious institutions, neighborhoods, and more. In turn, those microsystems are connected in a variety of ways and are themselves nested in a larger economic, social, and policy structure at the state, national, and global levels. For many of the people that our panelists have worked with and will share stories about today, those multiple ecological levels have caused harm and led to life-altering decisions that change each of the contexts in which they hope now to survive and thrive. In Jesuit higher education, whether we are students, staff, or faculty, we are called to bring our teaching and learning, our research and intervention, our service and community to bear on the pressing social issues of our time. Immigration is certainly one of these pressing social issues. We must reflect on our own positionality and consider what tools are in our own toolbox that can contribute to conversation, reflection, and action. My own work examines the assumptions and presumptions that the US immigration justice system holds, both implicit and explicit, both in design and implementation, about the capacities and experiences of children, families, young adults, and adults that are moved through the immigration system. I research how children and teens understand or misunderstand the complexity of the system and are often forced to navigate critical legal decisions that exceed their developmental capacities, often without any type of advocate. We've learned how the criminal justice system and immigration systems are intertwined in ways that create and perpetuate structural and institutional violence, and they must be changed. Those of us in Jesuit higher education are uniquely positioned and qualified to lift the voices of refugees and migrants, to partner in solidarity as we work for true second-order change to enhance the likelihood that individuals will experience the dignity of being heard and reduce the likelihood they will experience unnecessary trauma. We must engage in study of the world's social problems like immigration, educate our students and each other about the circumstances of refugees and migrants, and learn how through education, reflection, and action, we can promote reconciliation based on justice. Our panel today features speakers who exemplify the call to justice in immigration and migration. Our moderator is Genevieve Negrón-Gonzales, Associate Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of San Francisco. She is joined today by three panelists. José Cabrera is the Director of Education and Advocacy for Migration in the Ignatian Solidarity Network. Joan Rosenhauer is the Executive Director of Jesuit Refugee Service. Joanna Williams is the Executive Director of the Kino Border Initiative. After our panel presentation and discussion, I invite you to log into the live Zoom session for a live question and answer period with the panelists, and then to an examine with Juniper Ellis.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the plenary session on immigration and the call to justice in Jesuit higher education. My name is Genevieve Negrón-Gonzales. I am Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of San Francisco, and I'm delighted to serve as the facilitator for this plenary session. We are joined by three panelists who will hear from over the course of this hour. We're joined by José Cabrera, Director of Education and Advocacy for Migration at the Ignatian Solidarity Network. We're also joined by Joan Rosenhauer, Executive Director of Jesuit Refugee Services USA, and by Joanna Williams, Executive Director of the Kino Border Initiative. So thank you all so much for being here. We're really excited to hear from you. What we're going to do in terms of sort of format today is that we're going to ask each of our panelists to first share for a little bit, about 8 to 10 minutes, about the work of their organization, the work that they're engaged in doing to sort of accompany migrants in this particular historical political moment. So we're going to hear a little bit about the work that they're doing on the ground, the work of their organization. We'll start with that, hearing from each of the 3 panelists, and then we'll go ahead and move forward into a discussion guided by some questions that I throw out around some of the common themes in the work as a whole. All right, so with that, thank you so much. And José, I'll invite you to go ahead and share your screen.
Since 2004, ISN has worked with Jesuit high schools, Jesuit universities and colleges, and Jesuit parishes in networking, educating, and forming advocates toward a more just world. We focus on 3 main issues: migration, ecology, and criminal justice. Within our migration work, we view and we work through the formation of our allies and the empowerment of directly impacted individuals. ISN is cultivating an adjacent network that values the human dignity of every person, that advocates for these values in the public sphere. And we do this and we work towards this through our campaigns. This picture is from our Defend Daca campaign, right as the Supreme Court was hearing oral arguments for the Daca case. We would host various campaigns where we create moments where folks can learn and to understand about our broken immigration systems, have the tools and resources where they can go out and educate their community. A lot of our campaigns, we try and aim and focus on Jesuit colleges and universities to give that sense of community. And also these campaigns are a place where, for example, in our Defend Daca, we had these flyers that we also encourage, whether it was teachers or offices, to post those in their doors to be a way of showing DACA recipients or directly impacted immigrant students that this was a space where we understood the values, we respected the human dignity of all immigrants, and where dreamers, DACA recipients were welcome. We also create programs. Many of our programs aim to do that, continuing that education, but also giving tools and resources for our members to be able to then take those tools and go back into their community and organize, create moments of advocating, create moments of encounter. Within our Jesuit, our colleges and university students, we create two programs. One of it is our Migration Justice Summit, where it's a week long, and for these last 2 years have been virtual given the pandemic, where students will come, and particularly students who we would consider student organizers, who are working on their college campuses, creating moments of encounters, creating moments where they can educate their fellow classmates and create moments of advocacy where everyone on campus can advocate for humane immigration reform. In these places, in our programs, we hope that we give students the tools and parishioners, high school students, those tools that then they can go on and start working towards a more just world. And then the biggest piece, advocacy, advocating, which is a word that we use so much and in so many times. When I am a proud grad of Xavier University, and when I started working for ISN, one thing that I really truly started to understand what it meant to be a part of a Jesuit network, what it meant to go to a Jesuit school. And I learned a little bit about that when I was at Xavier. But one of the biggest pieces that helped me understand, I feel very proud to be a part of this Jesuit network, was how here at ISN we would talk about and share stories about St. Ignatius of Loyola, of Pedro Rupe, Jesuits who understood this idea that to walk with Jesus, to be in companion with him, is to work towards justice, is to advocate for a just world. And through the work of that, we have those moments of encounter with God. And I think in advocacy, when we advocate, and then when we see and when we work with students and with parishioners who are advocating, they have those moments of encounters with God. They see God, and they see it through the working to make this a better world. In many of our programs or presentations that I give to many of our students, I always ask them this question: what does it mean to advocate for humane immigration reform? What does that look like? Is that just going to DC and meeting with elected officials? Is that just signing a letter and signing a letter to send to your elected officials? Or does that mean through the policies that we're advocating for? At ISN, we don't spend too much time deep into the weeds of the policies of what is going on in DC. We take a step back and we look at each policy and we look at the direction and how our immigration system is built and working towards a better one. How are we making sure that we're treating all immigrants with dignity? How are we respecting them? And how are we welcoming them? How are we creating a country, a campus, a parish that welcomes all immigrants? And then I asked them, when you're doing this work, when you're advocating for humane immigration reform, you have to look at this as two paths. There's one path where it's, I would say, the traditional advocating. It's meeting with your elected officials. It's sending letters. It's calling your elected officials and pushing for legislation and policies that would change. But the other path that I think people don't always see as advocating is changing the hearts and the minds of your community to understand why the policies that we're advocating for, why the issues that we're advocating for, why they're just as important. My family and I have, my family has been undocumented for since this past February. We were lucky enough to adjust our status. And for the last 8 years, I have lived as a Daca recipient. And one thing that being a directly impacted immigrant, that I've always understood is, and being involved in this work, is that we can push legislation as much as we want. And sometimes we would have legislation that would actually pass and would become law. But I've seen so many times sometimes those legislations don't last long. Sometimes a new Congress, a new executive branch comes in and they change all of that. And the importance of pushing for policies, we also have to equally push to change the mind and the hearts. Because if we as a society, if we all can't see why creating a pathway for 11 million undocumented immigrants, welcoming asylum seekers, isn't something that that it's in our moral, then of course we're always going to be fighting to bring those policies back when someone comes and tries to take them away. We have to equally work to change the culture so we can keep those policies forever. when we do that work and how that looks like every day, I have the privilege of making sure of watching our students, especially at our universities, do that. And a lot of that looks from whether it's Undocu Week, it's Immigration Week, whether it's from different programs that students fight, whether it's creating scholarships that financially support DACA recipients, undocumented students, whether it's creating a place where directly impacted students can come, can gather, and can share resources one another, can feel community with each other. Through those works, through those programs, we start to change the culture. When I was a community organizer, and when I was organizing on my campus, I remember I had a friend from a different university who was doing very much similar work on immigration, told me that the president of that university said that it wasn't their responsibility to create programs for directly impacted immigrants. The universities was a place to prepare students for. That they weren't gonna work or allow to open, I think it was a center that they were working towards. When I think of that, I always think of, I think they looked at it wrong. You see, at a college campus, it's like a little city at times. At Xavier, we always called it the Xavier bubble, where we only focused and we only understood Cincinnati as what happened at Xavier. We never stepped outside of Xavier and looked at the neighborhoods around us and the community around us. But if we can build in the Xavier bubble a community that values, that respects, that creates a welcoming place for immigrants, then when we go out into the world, we accept that as a norm and we work towards that. And we understand that that is the culture change that we have to make. One of the other works that I've, because of my position at ISN and that how we've been able to grow our immigration work, is that we've been able to work strategically and empower directly impacted immigrants for them to be leaders. One of these programs has been the Undocu Jesuit Network. This is a program where directly impacted students have a space where they can come and they can gather, and they can talk about the world that they're living in, being undocumented. And they can also learn about the policies that are being implemented. Immigration policy is always changing every day. And what so many DACA recipients or undocumented students see is it's so hard to follow that all the time. And it can also be so draining. This space allows for students to come and to learn about those quick kind of policy updates, and also to understand how are those policies affecting our community. So then we take those conversations and we're able to then allow those students, for them to be the leaders for the network and how we respond to policies, how we create what a world, what a community that welcomes immigrant looks like. And through those spaces, we've shared the stories and uplifted their experiences to help other people understand, to help other people see what the work and the long road that we have ahead of us to make this world a more welcoming place for all, undocumented, DACA recipient, TPS holder, asylum seeker, refugee, doesn't matter.
Thank you so much, José, for sharing this really important work of ISN. So thank you. We will move now to hear from Joan Rosenhauer from Jesuit Refugee Services USA.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for having me. Thanks to everybody who's listening to this. I want to start by creating a little bit of the context for our work at Jesuit Refugee Service. So just kind of big picture, the most recent data suggests that there are nearly 80 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. That's more than the population of the UK. That's more than the population of Italy. It's a huge number of people. That's made up of 26 million refugees, who are people who have crossed an international border, but are not planning to stay where they are currently living, and maybe resettled in another country. And then there are 46 million internally displaced people who've fled their homes but have not crossed an international border. 4.2 million asylum seekers who have crossed an international border, arrived where they want to seek refuge, and have presented themselves for asylum, for protection. And then 3.6 million Venezuelans displaced abroad, and that's they're separated out because the UN does that for reasons I won't go into. A little bit more of the background. Most people of refugees as people who live in camps. Actually, 60% of refugees live in urban areas, and that makes them somewhat scattered in places where they can find apartments, but it's a little harder for them to build a community and for them to be served. So it just to lift up that complication. Also, people think of refugees as people who are about to be resettled somewhere, or they're about to go back home. And that's not the case. The estimated average length of displacement is 10 to 20 years. It's closer to 10 years for internally displaced people, 20 years for refugees, people who crossed a border. And in 2019, less than 1% of refugees were resettled to a country like the US. So clearly we have to think about how we respond to this enormous number of people who are facing a crisis in terms of the fact that they're going to be staying where they are for a very long period of time. I'm sure many of you are aware that the US had been facing a great reduction in the number of refugees we would accept. And now under President Biden, that is making its way back up, and he's promised 125,000 will be accepted next year. And just one other point, which is that children are so enormously impacted by this. 40% of all displaced people are children. More than half of refugee children are not in school. And I always like to lift up this picture, which was drawn by a Syrian refugee child. It just breaks my heart every time I see it, because children should not, when you give them crayons, that's not what they should draw. And there are millions of children around the world who have experienced that kind of trauma. And we cannot ignore that, both for the sake of their future, but also for the sake of everyone's future. How will we have a peaceful world in the future when there's so many children who've lived through that kind of trauma? So let me talk a little bit about JRS and how we respond to all of this. We are a work of the Society of Jesus, established 40 years ago in response to the Vietnamese boat people. It's unfortunate that today it's not just one country or one group of people we're responding to. We work in 57 countries, and in 2020 we served just over 1 million forcibly displaced people around the world. So the need has not diminished at all, unfortunately. We have 4 priority program areas, and the first one is reconciliation, because refugees typically, they flee their home, they end up somewhere where there are very different ethnic groups or nationalities or religious groups around them, and they've known violence and conflict. And so it's very important to help them build the skills so that they can build peace with the people around them. And by the way, the host communities are wondering, who are these people who just arrived? And we were already poor, and now there's even more people to support with fewer resources. So the idea of building skills for reconciliation, for example, in Cameroon, which is host to more than 270,000 refugees from the Central African Republic, all of our programs for youth and young adults, which could be recreation programs or social programs or vocational training programs, all of them involve both the refugee youth or young adults and host community young adults. So they have the daily experience of playing together, working together, et cetera, but we weave into it then skills for reconciliation and peace building so that they can carry those skills with them wherever they go. Our second priority area is mental health and psychosocial support for refugees, because we realized at one point that you can't just teach a child who's been through the kind of trauma that we saw in that picture. You can't just teach a child math and think they're going to do great. they have been through a trauma, and we have to help them deal with that trauma and come to terms with it. A key example of this would be in South Sudan, where we're working with child soldiers, former child soldiers, who are trying to be reintegrated back into their home communities. But what we do is we try to equip their teachers and their parents with psychological first aid skills. We educate the entire community to be a part of kind of surrounding them with welcome and support. And then we provide more particular mental health and psychosocial support, counseling, things like that, usually digitally, because there aren't a lot of clinical psychologists in remote South Sudan. But we do provide that kind of support digitally for the former child soldiers themselves. Our third area of priority is education and livelihoods, because we do believe that it's essential. You know, it's in some ways we weave mental health and psychosocial support into our education program, so teachers are trained in things, but also education itself is a form of mental health and psychosocial support, in the sense that for children, for students, it creates a sense of normalcy. You know, they are back in the classroom every day. They have a structure to their day. And it also communicates to them that they should have hope. They will have a future, and they need to be educated for their future. So life will not always be as difficult as it is now. So in the Jesuit tradition, we provide education starting with early childhood through primary, secondary, post-secondary, and higher education. And in those higher levels, always with an eye to the livelihoods, because we don't want to educate students for something that then they can't do anything with. And again, many refugees are going to be displaced in camps or in, or urban areas where they're not citizens for decades. So when we think about livelihoods, and again, this is all tied, but it's easier in 2 slides. What I want to highlight is that it's always market-based. The first thing we do is to do a market assessment, and there's an economy even in a refugee camp. There's every refugee camp has a water and sanitation program that's usually run by the UN or an INGO or something. They need plumbers. So we'll train plumbers to help, to get jobs with the water and sanitation program. And there are countless examples like that. If refugees are in an urban area where they can't legally work, there are still things they can do to create a livelihood that are a little bit more informal. But if they have good business skills, they can manage a little shop or, whatever it is. And so we really focus on making it market driven. And then I also want to lift up the digital work that we're doing, because we're doing a lot to train young people in digital skills, particularly Microsoft Office programs, but also more extensive coding if that's possible and if they have the background for it. But then we connect them, we make sure that we have a system to connect them to jobs all over the world. So the beauty of this is that they are no longer constrained by the geographic economy in a camp in rural Malawi, but they can actually get jobs, if they're French speaking, in France and in Canada and anywhere in the world. And you have to make sure they have the bank account that they can digitally get paid and things. But it is a huge opportunity for them, again, given the length of time they're likely to be in these camps, and making sure they can build a life for themselves. And mentoring is also a critical part of that, always having mentoring to make sure they're successful. Our fourth area of priority is advocacy. And we do this around the world where refugees can speak up and they won't be put in jail, obviously. And then, of course, in the US, because the US is such a critical player on so many policies affecting people around the world. And I love this picture of this young woman. And she's actually a high school girl, and she's from Eastern Chad. And many of us remember when the world was focused on the genocide in Darfur, and it was on our news feeds every night. But most of the world has forgotten about the genocide in Darfur at this stage. But those refugees from Darfur are still living in camps in Eastern Chad that are basically mud huts. I mean, it's a very rough life. I was able to be there a couple of years ago. And one of the challenges for education that girls face is that the facilities at the schools don't accommodate their need to take care of their mental hygiene needs. So the latrines are very small and they're shared with the boys, and there's just no way that a girl can take care of herself. using those latrines, and then they often don't have access to the supplies that they need. So the girls in these camps in Chad decided they were going to go to the Ministry of Education in Chad and let them know that in refugee camps, for high schools, they need to build the kind of latrines and provide the kind of supplies that girls need in order to manage their mental hygiene or their menstrual hygiene needs and be able to go to school on a regular basis and continue through high school. I thought that was so powerful that these young girls did that. But again, in the US, you've heard about the importance of advocacy from José. Some of the key things we're working on are vaccine equity, and we know the Biden administration has done things on that, but the need is huge, and so that's important to work on. Also, asylum, both the asylum system globally has been so undermined by the pandemic because people just closed their borders. And in the US, that's happening through something called Title 42, and we're trying, which is a response to the pandemic and closing our borders as a result. We're working on that. We're also working on the refugee resettlement numbers and making sure that the resources are there to rebuild that. And then funding for education around the world. I've already mentioned how important that is for children, and the US is a key source of funding for that. And we need to make sure Congress and the administration continue that commitment. One other thing I want to lift up is that we have 2 programs in the US. One is our Detention Chaplaincy program, and that we provide chaplains in 5 detention centers where people are being detained by the US government. And we make sure everybody can practice their religion, no matter what their religion is. But we also provide some pastoral support and stress management programs and things like that to support people in that difficult setting where they're being detained by the US government. And then we just opened a binational border program in El Paso and Juarez, working with JRS Mexico. So we're operational on both sides of the border. And there we're focusing on legal support and then also, again, mental health and psychosocial support. And just to give you an example, one of my colleagues was at a shelter in Juarez, and a lot of women were waiting to come across. They were hoping to be released from the migrant protection protocols, which had kept people in Juarez in Mexico. And she said one of the hardest things was that while she was on her way to the US, she'd lost her father, and she had never been able to grieve. She had never been able to say goodbye, and it just was eating at her. And she, with my colleagues and the staff, organized a grieving session for the women in the shelter because they had all lost, either the loss of a loved one had caused them to flee or they had lost someone on the way. And so they were able to go through a process. They wrote to this person and shared their love and support, and then, you know, went through a group process where they dealt with some of their grief. But it just gives you an example of the kinds of things that can be done to help people in these difficult circumstances that really make a difference for them when they've been suffering. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to further discussion.
Thank you so much, Joan. We really appreciate hearing about this really important work. The floor is yours, Joanna.
Thank you so much. It's such a joy to be with you even virtually. And certainly an honor to follow José and Joan. And you know, when Genevieve announced this order, I thought, I don't know exactly why in this order, but I think it's been beautiful for us to look specifically at what is mobilizing the Ignatian network look like inside of the US. What's the view and work of Jesuit Refugee Service and the situation of folks who are displaced globally? And now let's zoom in into a small microcosm of all of the above, since we partner very closely with JRS and ISN on several of these programs. Let's zoom in on what that actually looks like in one very specific geographic place, which is where the Kino Border Initiative is located, here in ambos Nogales. So Nogales, Sonora, and Nogales, Mexico. The Kino Border Initiative is a binational Jesuit and Catholic ministry on the US-Mexico border. And for us, our binationality is critical. If we can't figure out within our own organization what it means to be a Mexican organization and a US organization, to have Mexican staff and US staff, then who are we to tell anybody else in the world how to live solidarity across borders? And I love that Joan ended with sharing about that new JRS project on the US-Mexico border in El Paso, Juarez, because they're navigating many of those similar dynamics. And it's a great challenge and a great blessing to be able to work in this border space in a way that in an approach that feels more just and more equitable. And so KBI does this work in 3 different dimensions. The first is humanitarian assistance. And I give lots of presentations. For every single other presentation that I've ever given, I have said, and our humanitarian assistance is the only part that's not binational because it only happens on the Mexican side of the border. Well, for this presentation specifically, I have breaking news, which is that the Kino Border Initiative is now also assisting migrants on the US side of the border in our offices in Nogales, Arizona. So I got a call a couple of weeks ago from Customs and Border Protection in Arizona, and they said, well, we're not gonna transport people from the port of entry up to Tucson, Arizona to release them for the asylum process. So will your staff receive them in the office so that then they can board transport funded by FEMA and organized through the Pima County government? And my first instinct was to say no. And then I called our our director of administration, who's based in that office. I thought, gosh, he's so busy with the audit and the finances and all of that. He probably doesn't even have time to spend an hour receiving migrants in our US office. And as soon as I asked him, he said, well, this is our mission, isn't it? We'll make it happen. Let's respond. So now we actually do give humanitarian assistance on both sides of the border, though the Nogales, Arizona piece is a tiny, tiny fraction of our work. The majority of the folks that we serve are on the Mexican side of the border, and you can see here a photo of us serving meals in a COVID-safe way, which we've been doing now for over a year, that we adapted to the realities of coronavirus and said, people in the Nogales are going to die of hunger before they die of coronavirus if we're not able to respond and continue to provide humanitarian services. So we do provide food and clothing and medical assistance and for other basic needs in Nogales, Mexico, in our majority, with that little tiny addition of Nogales, Arizona recently. I think just as importantly, and Joan and José have both touched on this in their presentations, we also try to listen very carefully to the migrants that we're receiving and figure out from them, how can we work on the other 2 dimensions, which is education and advocacy. So it's what José mentioned about how do we change hearts and minds in the US and in Mexico, and then also how do we change policy in the US and in Mexico. And I emphasize the binationality of our advocacy because certainly the US has an outsized influence in what happens in Nogales, Mexico. But the Mexican government also has a role and a responsibility, and the individual citizens in the community here in Nogales, Mexico. Their approach matters and their willingness or lack thereof to be hospitable. So that kind of changing hearts and minds matters at a highly local level, as well as in a binational and international space. And we've been doing this work in 3 dimensions for over a decade. I think what's been unique about the last year is how much of a leadership role the migrants themselves have taken in the advocacy specifically. And Joan spoke to this with the example that she gave of refugees in Chad. We've had this, during this pandemic, the unfortunate situation of many people stranded in Nogales, Mexico, which isn't what we would want to see. And yet at the same time, we've been able to take advantage of that space and empower and accompany people to defend their own rights. And even the children, so this is a photo from a march that the kids in Nogales organized in October of last year to really put a spotlight on what has it been like for them to be waiting in this limo, to be out of school, all of the different realities that Joan spoke to. They organized a march, they were the speakers. You see some of the drawings and the posters, and what's been moving for us is to see the children come into their own voices and their own dignity, and also in part do that because they're seeing their parents become empowered and recognize their dignity and defend their rights. And if we have a little bit of time in the question and answer later, hopefully Genevieve will ask me to share more stories about that. Because I have a couple of other stories I'd love to share about our Save Asylum marches that ISN has participated in and done all the back-end tech work for. So we appreciate that collaboration. So that's the context of the way that we're responding to the realities in Nogales, Mexico. just to give a really brief overview of the situation at the border, I think we have to start to understand what's happening in Nogales, Mexico. We have to start elsewhere because the border is a microcosm of dynamics of the entire region. And right now it's a microcosm of, in part, climate displacements. This is a photo from Guatemala that was hit, Central America was hit by 2 hurricanes last fall. And that has continually come up in the months since as a strong reason for migration. I was speaking to a man just last week who had his house and he had his land and he was farming and was, I wouldn't say well off, but at least was surviving and able to support his family. But his house was right by the river and the river overflowed its banks, destroyed all of his land and damaged his house. And he looked around and he said, there's just no way for me to rebuild. Where am I going to get the money to rebuild from? So having many people who are migrating for what we would call ecological reasons or climate displacement, even though they might articulate that as an economic migration. It's really an economic marginalization that then has been compounded by environmental disasters that are driven by climate change. And then we also have a population of folks who are fleeing violence from Central America, from Venezuela, from Cuba, and even from here in Mexico. So the photo on the right is a woman who I'll call Elena and her son. And Elena, again, was relatively well off, at least lower middle class in Guerrero. She's a single mom, but she was able to support herself with the job that she was working until she was sexually assaulted at the workplace. And decided to come forward and report the individual who assaulted her. And it turns out that that individual had ties to organized crime. And since that point has been persecuted by not just that individual, but also that entire network. And so she fled her home in Guerrero almost exactly a year ago, about a year and 2 months ago, and arrived to Nogales after the pandemic had already started. After the border had already been closed under Title 42, which I'm going to speak about in a moment. And it's interesting that, what Joan was speaking about in the grieving ceremony, because it's something we hear so commonly from the asylum seekers who are stranded here in Nogales. They say, I would give anything to go home and lay flowers on my parents' grave. I would give anything to have been there when my father-in-law died or was even killed. But they know that going back could be a death sentence. And so they're in this limbo of a place that is, I was just talking to Elena a couple of days ago and she said, you might think that because I've been here for a year, I've settled, but I've never settled because I've never felt like my son could be safe. All that I want my son to do, her son's 12 years old. She said to me, my son has never been able to play in a park. He's never been in a place safe enough, whether that's in Guerrero or now in Nogales, where he could play in a park. And that's really my desire for him. So that's some of the many reasons that folks are arriving here to Nogales. And then what are they encountering? They're encountering this wall. They're encountering a wall in a physical sense, but also very much in a policy sense. And the Trump administration and asylum, access to protection and asylum has never been easy to obtain at the border. It wasn't easy under the Obama administration. The Trump administration focused on systematically dismantling access to asylum through a number of different policies, which I won't get into the alphabet soup of them, but I do think Title 42 is particularly significant, which Joan mentioned already. Title 42 used the pandemic as a pretext to close off access to due process at the border. It's actually not an order, technically an immigration order, it's technically a public health order. And for us, it was a little farcical because at the time it was implemented, the coronavirus rates in the US were many, many times higher than in Mexico. It was before coronavirus had really taken hold in Mexico that all of a sudden the US was excluding people from Mexico to keep our country safe from the public health threat. And it didn't make sense then, it still doesn't make sense now. But it has real consequences in people's lives and livelihoods. I'm here actually presenting, all you see behind me is a purple wall, but I'm looking out on where we've served breakfast and where we had our new arrivals today. And just of the folks who arrived today, we had some individuals who are fleeing violence in their homes, countries, who expressed that to Border Patrol when they were detained and who were sent back with no regard for their situation. They were sent back, some of them in the middle of the night here in Nogales. So it's these immediate expulsions. And it also means that folks like Elena continue to be stranded. There's a little chink in that wall, so there's tiny windows opening for exceptions to Title 42 under if for people who are particularly vulnerable or who have been in a situation of prolonged displacement. And we're recording this session right now in mid-May. By the time we actually go live and have the Q&A, I'll probably have some updates on how that's impacting us here in Nogales. There's not much that I can say, or at least say publicly right now, but I know that there will be more that I can say in a few weeks. So stay tuned for the Q&A at the end of this session. Even if we resolve the issue of access to asylum at the border. So it's your advocacy on that is critical. Advocacy to end Title 42 is critical. We need Congress to act. We need the president to act. And yet, even if we make that change, it's not going to affect the folks who are displaced by the hurricanes. It's not going to affect people who are coming up for economic reasons, whose family members are sick and they want to pay for their food. And what we're seeing, ultimately, people have enormously important reasons to migrate. And the US strategy since the mid-1990s is, if we just make this more and more difficult, if we push people out into further and further rural areas where they risk dying in the desert, then people will stop coming. And with that policy, which is called prevention through the deterrence, the US government dramatically underestimated people's reasons for migration. It turns out that people are at risk death for the chance of making it into the United States, for the chance of avoiding death in their home country or of giving their kids a future. A lot of these parents are just making complicated decisions about what's best for their family and what's best for their kids. So with both the restrictions on asylum, but also this dynamic of climate displacement and all of the lack of options for legal migration into the United States, we're seeing more and more people who are spending more time in the desert and who are running. When we receive them, it's because they survived, but who are reporting coming across dead bodies as they walk. Last year was one of the years with the highest number of deaths in the Arizona desert. We're coming up now in the hottest time of the season. We had a couple of folks from Guatemala who were displaced by the hurricane, who 2 weeks ago spent 8 days in the desert. They spent several days without food and water. And they were so severely dehydrated when they arrived to Nogales that we had to rush them to the hospital and buy several IV bags to rehydrate them. So it's no exaggeration to say our immigration policy is a matter of life and death. And I hope that all of you who are watching this, it's easy to be overwhelmed by those stakes. It's easier to say, well, if it's a matter of life and death, what's my role? It's actually, because it's a matter of life and death, you all and we all have the opportunity to choose life. And we choose life by living into solidarity, by believing that other people's lives do matter, and that we can be part of that community, we can make a difference through advocacy, through accompaniment, and through sharing and so raising awareness in our communities. Ultimately, if we can, there's a phrase in the Jesuit migration network that says, hospitality reminds us that another world is possible. So you listening to this webinar and not just walking away and saying, that's a lot of tough situations about migration, but actually saying, well, maybe there's something that I can do. And we're going to talk about that right now in the question and answer, but maybe there's something that I can do in order to be part of choosing life for folks at the border, for folks displaced around the world. That's the invitation that I'd like to make to all of you.
Thank you so much to each of you. And I'm confident that we can pick up on some of these strands in terms of what it means to really answer the call and accompany migrants and refugees in this moment as we further the conversation in an ongoing way, both in the live Q&A that will follow this session, but also in sort of just the conversations that can happen across this incredible network in thinking about what it means, as you said, to take effective, thoughtful action on these questions. And I think one thing that stands out really clearly from hearing you all speak about this work is that the time is right and the time is now. We need to be answering this call and thinking about this in very concrete ways in terms of how we make this work a priority, not only on our campuses, but in our lives. And I think that each of you and the work of your organization have just shared such a really critical, beautiful example of what it means to answer that call. So thank you so much for being here. Joanna, Joan, José, thank you for sharing your work. Thank you for doing the work. And for the audience who is watching, we welcome you to stay on. Actually not stay on, it's a different link is my understanding, but to join us for the live question and answer with this same stellar panel of folks that will start at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to seeing you in the live Q&A.